man face justice for
I think it's responsible. I don't know what happened to him.
Well, you should.
Well, you don't even care like that left me really as a hero.
I don't know what happened. I hope the PA member that's assigned to us tonight has watched that and realised the man they've been defending when they're right.
Now then, this is being used to target Patriotic Alternative. It's extremely interesting that all this is being rehashed all of a sudden now that Patriotic Alternative have become the leading group on the dissident right end of the spectrum. I'm aware No White Guilt does not like the term dissident right, but it works for us. Patriotic Alternative have received much media attention and attention from Hope Not Hate. That's all because they supplanted the Zio Civnats such as EDL for Britain and the Tommy Robinson cabal. Instead of talking about how a group that has had no assistance from this state or any other state, and thus they've become the alpha males on this spectrum of politics, and how this visceral, traditional and long-standing nationalism of ethno-nationalism has displaced the modern and unnatural civic nationalism. We're not talking about that for some reason, but folks want to talk about one comment made by a man who at best is loosely associated with Patriotic Alternative, a man called Mr. Masilamani. The opponents of Patriotic Alternative are using this, but we're here to look at it in a fresh light. So let's turn this fresh lens onto the situation. Marc Lister of Fascists Beware believes this is a gotcha moment in that he's trapped Mr. Masilamani, saying he knew of a grooming gang operating in Stepney, and he was invited by those locals, the local men operating the gang. He was invited by them to have his way with a European lady who was trafficked in a house in that locality.
White women. They can't say that to you, Dan. I hear it all the time. If I solicit it, they're open with me. If I pretend I agree with it, they tell me even more. I've had boys saying, hey, there's a house with a young girl. Hear me out, Dan. The audience want to listen to me too.
I literally don't. I've got the audience.
I'm giving you two chances, Dan.
No, that is true, Dan.
Or you will get
true. Unfortunately, it is true.
The audience don't want to listen to your joke. They want to hear about the real stories. So, for example, recently, when I spoke to some of the boys, they're 24, they're like, hey, we found a new Polish girl. She's now totally hooked on a bit of chalk. If you go to her house, she's managed to film. Do you want to come? Do you want to go? We keep going there.
Did you report them to the police?
Their attitude.
Mr. Lister picks at the contradictions in the narrative and the changing nature of the narrative as he gets Mr. Masilamani tied up in knots, squirming. He has very little wriggle room, and the moral question of why he did not report it to the police is bashed on his head repeatedly in hammer-like fashion. But the big question here is, what's all this got to do with Mr. Collett, Miss Towler and Patriotic Alternative? I'll answer that. Absolutely nothing. Mr. Masilamani, at the time of these claims, he was working for Zio Civnat of the Robinson cabal, the Tommy Robinson group. As an Asian man living in an Asian area of East London, Stepney, his unique selling point to that movement would have been access to that community. Mr. Masilamani is not a stupid man. He knew what the Tommy cabal want. They want stories of Muslim terror attacks and grooming. Mr. Masilamani is all too aware the Zio Civnat movement encourages dishonesty, and in my opinion, he just made this story up to give the Zio Civnat cabal an injection of further propaganda and material. This is all in the knowledge that the Robinson movement was cradled in deceit. It was born out of deceit. Look at the figurehead, a convicted fraudster, says it all. Look at the misuse of donation money, all the allegations around that. Look at the insider, Donna Sexton, another convicted fraudster. Look at the way they use selfies with unassuming football players such as Paul Ince and Man City's Edison, and then later make out that these folks support their movement. Talking about grift and deceit, Mr. Ezra Levant is still to this day soliciting donations for Justice for Chelsea. This despite the former insider Caelan Robertson saying Tommy Robinson walked away from the campaign a month into the campaign once he realised it was fake. Focus on the hoi polloi of the movement. They are simply tasked with chanting Tommy's name, spreading his content online and donating, but even they know the movement encourages deceit. There'll be no questions asked if your deceit falls flat on its face, because that entire organisation is corrupt from bottom up, all the way up to the likes of Ezra Levant.
Emily Jones's parents says, I just want people to know the truth, because people were saying it was a Somalian on social media, but it weren't. It was an Albanian Grimmin. I went in the first court appearance, I seen the woman and I heard them say Albanian. So I know, and I transferred that outside so people didn't keep saying Somalian.
Circling all the way back to Mr. Masilamani, he was just doing the same. He was following the unwritten protocol which is taught through a process of unintellectual osmosis. He knew the masses in the Zio Civnat want that type of material, and he just gave it them. He gave it to them with interest. Sure, what he did was immoral. He lied, he made stuff up. We're not encouraging that. We're not apologising for that at all. We're not apologists for deceit. He did it for the movement, which encourages deceit. He's no longer part of the Zio Civnat cabal. Keep that in mind. I'd imagine they've got a replacement for Mr. Masilamani. Mr. Masilamani is no longer part of the Zio Civnat cabal, even though they probably wish he was, because he's a capable thinker. Now, we do recognise it's a dangerous lie, as it puts the Stepney community in a precarious position. We're not endorsing it, but we just simply recognise it's standard fare to sit on deceit or produce deceit in that movement. Deceit is a grist for the Zio Civnat cabal and that mill. If Mr. Lister wants Mr. Collett and Miss Towler to comment, then for consistency purposes, you'd expect him to ask his colleague Mike Stuckbury and folks behind Byline Times to ask about Caelan Robertson's past work whilst operating for the same Zio Civnat den of deceit. Did Mr. Robertson, back in the day, did he not put out the claim that Tommy was being moved to a Muslim majority prison in order to boost up the donations and the hype around Tommy's incarceration? Was Mr. Robertson not around when much of that deceit was happening? He's on record saying Tommy's team learnt Justice for Chelsea was a fake campaign a month into it. So why did Mr. Robertson sit on those lies? How about Justice for Our Boys? We know from Mr. Safa, Mr. Robinson walked away from it when he found out he couldn't make it about Muslims, and it turned out to be a Hindu named drink driver.
But she went to Speaker's Corner March 2018. Bless her heart, Union Jack Wellernette felt sorry for her. We all did. Tommy looked at it, yeah? Tommy looked at it and thought, bang, she went to Tommy for help to get the audience. When we found, not me personally, or Tommy, when it came out, they weren't Muslims. And Tommy could have got nicked over this, like he's going to get nicked over the Syrian boy. Yeah? Tommy could have told a load of lies for a story. Where would Tommy have got? Prison. For making false lies up. So Tommy pulled away from it. You don't understand his point, can't you?
Mr. Lister's ideological colleague, Mr. Robertson, would have known about this too, one presumes. For that matter, maybe Mr. Lister would like to bring up Hope Not Hate's head honcho himself, Matthew Collins, who was part of the Combat 18 group, so he says. For me, Mr. Masilamani lying for a group which encourages falsehood is not front page news. I believe Mr. Masilamani has backtracked on this without making a public statement. We're seeing this in his actions of not continuing with this talking point. His indication to me, he no longer is willing to push this claim. So he's not peddling this type of trash for Patriotic Alternative, as Patriotic Alternative have higher values for truth and honesty than the Zio Civnat cabal that Mr. Masilamani formerly assisted. It's an unfortunate past though, which Mr. Masilamani, I'm sure, once left in the past. My question concerning Mr. Lister is, why is he not focusing on his core lefties who have attacked Patriotic Alternative activists and stole their property only last week? Patriotic Alternative have a democratic right to protest, demonstrate and assembly. WLM is not against the law, and celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day is something that should be encouraged, but for some reason the Indigenous Brits cannot do so without fear of being attacked by individuals on the far left. Let's keep in mind the left is a facilitator of capitalism and globalism. The establishment used the Zio Civnats of the Tommy cabal for around 15 years for their globalist and imperialist agendas. Now that there's a Cold War against China, the state does not require the likes of Tommy Robinson. That vacuum has now been filled by traditional British nationalism, which has stung the left and the conservative establishment. It's a punch in their nose. They've been given a bloody nose by Patriotic Alternative. The left and the conservatives failed the indigenous working class people. We were never asked resonates with millions in the nation, and if the left's social stigma and the state's threat of legal repercussion was all removed tomorrow, allowing folks to openly state their beliefs, there would be millions proclaiming the 14 words and millions saying they agree with Patriotic Alternative. The globalists and the left know it, hence why they work hand in hand to stifle this sentiment. Mark my words, the next tactic that they will use vis-a-vis Patriotic Alternative and stunting them is to try and link Patriotic Alternative, a peaceful activist and potentially political outfit, with National Action and other such proscribed entities. And remember the words of Ricky Doolan saying that Patriotic Alternative is a dangerous movement, quote unquote dangerous movement. That narrative will be peddled further. Keep that in mind.